Oh, bonjour, hello, and welcome to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and for those partners of ours who are joining us from the other side of the pond, guten tag. My name is Zach Pakin. I am a non-resident research fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy in Toronto, and it is my great pleasure to put on this event today that brings together two of my affiliations, on the one hand with IPD here in Toronto, and also as a member of the Cooperative Security Initiative based in Vienna, which I will explain in just a moment, for a very special and timely discussion on Canada's role in European security and the extent to which it needs to be rethought. We are obviously living in a time of tremendous global change. That much is obvious, not only with an international order in transition, but also with a great power rivalry that has deepened significantly in recent years, even more so during the coronavirus pandemic. And with global balance of power also shifting eastwards, the global center of gravity, if you will, shifting eastwards, this raises some interesting and fundamental questions about what role Europe will continue to play in Canadian security, in Canadian foreign policy, and in Canadian grand strategy. And for that, we have three excellent panelists who are with us today. Unfortunately, Frédéric Méran from Sérieux 2M is not able to join us today. He's feeling unwell, but we wish him a speedy recovery. And we still have three excellent panelists who are with us. But before I introduce them, please allow me to introduce IPD, as well as the Cooperative Security Initiative. So the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, or IPD, aims to cultivate a network of experts, scholars, and practitioners who are ready to provide fresh perspectives and constructive ideas to resolve global security challenges and manage the coming great power competition through peaceful means. In doing so, IPD believes that it's necessary to engage with questions of power, as well as the Atlantic Bloc's role in the world, in a more systematic, objective, and policy-sensitive manner. The international system is not a zero-sum winner-take-all prize to be won or a battle space to be dominated, and therefore IPD's mission asserts that a healthy conception of the national interest is foundational to a new foreign policy premised on tolerance for cultural pluralism and different ways of life, enthusiasm for diplomatic engagement and other non-coercive instruments of power, and a commitment to military restraint. The Cooperative Security Initiative, or CSI, is designed to generate ideas and shift momentum in favor of cooperative security and multilateralism in order to build a safer Europe. The CSI is conceptualized and carried out by two think tanks, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe, which is based in Vienna, and they are our partners in organizing today's event, as well as GlobeSec, a leading think tank based in Bratislava. The initiative was launched at the GlobeSec Forum in June of 2019 with the support of Slovakia's chairmanship of the OSCE, and the former OSCE Secretary General Thomas Greminger endorsed the initiative and offered the OSCE Secretariat's support. The initiative is composed of experts from all OSCE regions, and I am the representative from Canada, not representing Canada in any official capacity, but as simply a Canadian participant in the group. Distrust between Russia and the West creates increasingly the risk of military incidents, accidents, and escalation. And at the same time, the safety nets of arms control agreements and confidence building measures are being cut away. In fact, today is a particularly meaningful day for us to be holding this discussion, seeing as it was just announced this morning that President Vladimir Putin of Russia has decided to initiate formally the withdrawal process of Russia from the Open Skies Treaty following the Biden administration's decision to uphold the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty. So that's another element of the multilateral security architecture in Europe that has faded away now following the INF Treaty, the CFE Treaty, the ABM Treaty, and others. New START is surviving for the next 5 years for now. There are fundamentally different narratives on both sides right now between Russia and the West on how we got here so soon after what was supposed to have been a new era of democracy, peace, and unity after the end of the Cold War. And furthermore, both sides seem to be convinced still at this point that they are right and that it is the responsibility of the other side to change its ways first. The status quo is deteriorating in Europe right now and therefore not acceptable. And this is the premise for the CSI's existence. So allow me please to introduce our three excellent panelists who are with us today, beginning with Walter Kemp, who is the director of the Southeastern Europe Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, or GI. Before joining GI, Walter was the head of the Strategic Policy Support Unit at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Between 2010 and 2016, he worked at the International Peace Institute, IPI, where he led the Institute's Peace Without Crime project. Previously, he served for 4 years as spokesman and speechwriter at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And between 1996 and 2006, he was at the OSCE, including as a senior advisor to the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities and senior advisor to the Secretary General, and OSCE chairmanships. Walter, who is Canadian, has a PhD in international relations from the LSE, as well as degrees in political science and history from U of T and McGill University. And in addition to his work at GI, he is a special advisor to the Cooperative Security Initiative. He's one of the co-authors of the report along with myself. And so he will be introducing the report today. He also teaches at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna. Carrie Buck, our second panelist, was most recently Assistant Secretary to the Treasury Board Economic Sector from 2018 to 2021. Prior to that, she was Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to NATO from 2015 to 2018. Ms. Buck is a career diplomat who served as political director and assistant deputy minister for international security and political affairs, assistant deputy minister for Afghanistan, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and director general for the Middle East and the Maghreb. Earlier in her career, she was posted to the Canadian Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York. Ms. Buck was also chair of government task forces for Afghanistan, Russia, Ukraine, Syria, Mali, and other foreign policy crises, and led the Canadian government responses to major natural disasters such as the Haiti earthquake in Nepal, Philippines, etc. She represented Canada on international negotiations of women, women, peace, and security issues from 1992 to 2018, helping build international law and practice on gender-based violence. And throughout her diplomatic career, she represented Canada at the G7, at the UN, NATO, the OSCE, and the Organization of American States on issues of human rights, security, disarmament, terrorism, humanitarian affairs, and regional trade. Ms. Buck also served in the Privy Council Office, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the International Development and Research Centre, and the Constitutional Law Bureau of the Office of the Attorney General of Ontario. So we are particularly grateful to have you, Carrie, with us today and to count on your expertise. And finally, Doug Saunders is the Globe and Mail's international affairs columnist. He has been a writer with the Globe since 1995 and has extensive experience as a foreign correspondent, having run the Globe's foreign bureaus in London and Los Angeles. He has also done extensive reporting in the Middle East, North Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and in East Asia. And from 2013 to 2015, he was the paper's online opinion editor and creator of the online Globe debate section. He has won the National Newspaper Award, which is the Canadian counterpart to the Pulitzer Prize, on 5 occasions, including an unprecedented 3 consecutive awards for critical writing between 1998 and 2000, and awards also honoring him as Canada's best columnist in 2006 and in 2013. He has also won the Stanley McDowell Prize for writing and has been shortlisted for a National Magazine Award. The author of 3 books, he is now a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy, and we're very grateful to have you with us today as well, Doug. So over to you, Walter, to introduce the Cooperative Security Initiative and its signature report, which was published earlier this spring.
Thanks very much, Zach, and thanks for the invitation. And it's a real honor and a pleasure to be on such a prestigious panel and talking with Canadians, but people also interested in Canadian foreign policy. As Zach mentioned, I was very much behind this Cooperative Security Initiative and one of the drafters of the report, along with Zach and about 18 other policy experts from across Europe, and I mean wider Europe, plus North America. And what brought us together in 2019 was a common concern about tensions between Russia and the West, concern about weakness in the multilateral system at a time when we need multilateralism more than ever, and also a desire of cooperation. And you have to remember, this was 2019. Trump was president. Things were looking grim and on a trajectory to being even worse. As we went through our preliminary discussions, we realized that the group was not like-minded, and we weren't going to attempt to draft a report where we would have to agree by consensus. Also, we wanted to do something that was a little bit different, not a kind of standard report that would reflect official language or risk sitting on a shelf. We wanted to shake things up a bit. So instead of coming up with answers for everything, we came up with 18 questions. And these questions were designed to provoke debate. And the way that we went about provoking this debate was to put the questions on YouTube, on internet, trying to reach out to as many people as possible, not just policymakers, but get people thinking about why the current situation is dangerous and why we need to improve the situation and how. Then COVID broke out, so our whole set of assumptions changed, and we added a 19th question about the impact of COVID. But over time, we got more than 300 responses from people about how they view European security and how they envision the future. I would like to focus just on a few highlights, but to make the point that we're witnessing an inflection point in European security, when the old rules and institutions have been undermined, but new ones are not yet in place. So we're very much in a state of flux. With that in mind, we asked people how they would see the situation in 5 to 10 years. And if I can share my screen here, I'll show you a graphic representation of the answers. And Zach, please tell me if you can indeed see this. Okay, this is more dramatic when you have the report, because it's a bit like a children's story where the first time you open it up, you can see the bridge on the left with people looking at a map, looking to the horizon where things look rather sinister. Then you have opening pages that when you open them up, it looks like this. So basically, people identified 4 possible scenarios. One is battleground Europe, and you can see that literally goes right over the edge here. The other is Groundhog Day Europe, where we're going to have the same thing happening again and again. There's a roundabout there. People go all the way back to the beginning and go in circles. Stabilized Europe, we're more on the right track. There are a few bumps in the road. And the ultimate, the ideal scenario is a cooperative Europe. About 25% of all recipients identified a type of scenario like cooperative Europe. And we looked at possible short-term, mid-term, and long-term ways of finishing that bridge. And some of the keystones are still in the water there with some keywords, including reciprocity, trust, etc. The question is, how do we get onto that cooperative road, if that is indeed the road that we think that we should be going along? One issue that came up is that we cannot only be looking within existing alliances. You have to find a way to talk to your enemies. Right now, the situation is highly polarized. People are within their own echo chambers. It's very difficult for the West to talk and engage with Russia and vice versa. But I'm reminded of the 1960s when we had a little bit of a similar situation, and the Harmel report of 1967, which put a strong emphasis on deterrence, but also talked about the importance of détente. This begs the question, do you have to have shared values with the people that you're talking to? Can Canada, for example, only work with other liberal democracies? Or is it possible to identify common interests with other countries where you can work together? I think this is quite important because many of the threats and challenges that we see are not only threats and challenges between states. They're what Kofi Annan once described as problems without passports, pandemics, climate change, organized crime, migration, things that transcend borders that no countries, not even the strongest, can deal with on their own. And in our report, we quoted UN Secretary General Guterres from the 75th session of the General Assembly, where he said, in an interconnected world, it's time to recognize a simple truth: solidarity is self-interest. It's not altruism, it's self-interest. And indeed, probably on some of these global issues, either there's a cooperative solution or there's no solution at all. That said, and again, don't forget we were writing this at the beginning in the time of Trump, that you can't just pursue a kind of functional or transactional approach to international relations. There have to be rules, a degree of predictability, transparency, and fairness. And that's why in the title we refer to principled cooperation. It has to be based on principles. So what is the plan? We came up with short, medium, and longer term suggestions. The first is to engage in dialogue. It's interesting now, the Biden-Putin meeting coming up. Exercise restraint, tone down the rhetoric. And it may be that the sides can't agree on something, but they could surely agree that they don't want the situation to get worse. And we thought that that in itself is not a bad starting point. Furthermore, you don't have to go into these meetings thinking that you can solve the problems, but at least manage the relationship peacefully, have some kind of guardrails, predictability, and common commitments to de-escalate and demilitarize the situation. Zach mentioned off the top that the safety net that we've had since the end of the Cold War is being cut away. One of our recommendations is try and hang on to as much as possible, as long as possible, and try and use existing confidence and security building measures, for example. Agree on modalities to prevent incidents and accidents in the air and at sea, over the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, and use existing mediation frameworks where the United States and the Russian Federation are already present, for example, dealing with Nagorno-Karabakh, Iran, Syria, to use that as confidence building measures amongst the mediators and not only amongst the parties. Of course, one of the biggest challenges is to push for peaceful resolution of the crisis in and around Ukraine, and that was obviously a shadow hanging over the drafting of the report. In the midterm, we suggest to have a frank discussion on threats and challenges to security, to look at perceptions, to reaffirm existing commitments, see if they can be interpreted in the context of new realities, but that doesn't necessarily that we need new ones, but with cyber threats and so on, and technology, it might be worth bringing some of those up to date. And if possible, revive decisions on arms control. Zach mentioned CFE was never adapted across the board, and now we're probably in a more tenuous situation than we were since the early 1990s. Longer term, our suggestion is that we think it would be helpful to have a high-level event, perhaps in 2025, to correspond with the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, or maybe we don't want to or can't wait that long, but to somehow restore the European security framework, because we say in the report, it shouldn't take a war to do this. That the last 3 times that there was major reform of the international system was always after a war. 1815, the Congress of Vienna, 1919, Treaty of Versailles, 1945. In a nuclear age, that's not something that we can afford. Just in conclusion, what could Canada's role be in all of this? First, I would argue, and this is not in the report, this is my personal view, but to understand the need to create these openings for détente and dialogue, and not only deterrence, and to have concentric engagement. So obviously Canada is going to get along easiest with like-minded countries in NATO, etc., but also look for outer layers where the cooperation might be thinner, but where you nevertheless have openings for discussing what we refer to as islands of cooperation. Encourage more military-to-military dialogue. If some of these CSBMs and treaties, which were the places where there was the possibility for dialogue, if that's being cut away, we now have less mill-to-mill dialogue than during the Cold War. That's not a good situation. Third, work to hang on to existing treaties, as I mentioned, and encourage implementation of CSBMs. And fourth, and finally, encourage a wider perception of security. That Canada very much pioneered the idea of human security. I realize that's gone out of favor a little bit, but most of the issues that affect people's security, and this came through in our questionnaire, cannot be resolved by military solutions. So military alliances are not the only solution. People are worried about things like pandemics, terrorism, climate change, etc. And all of these require cooperative solutions. So those are issues and areas where Canada could have profile, could contribute its expertise, could build bridges and increase its soft power, and in the process enhance both its own national security and contribute to a safer and more sustainable future to the planet. So I encourage you to have a look at the report. It's written in a very user-friendly way. We invested a lot of time, and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung invested a lot of money in the graphics. We hope that it can provoke debate. Again, we're not pretending to have all of the answers, but we tried to ask provocative questions and get people thinking about the need for different approaches to security, including cooperative approaches.
Thanks very much, Walter, for that excellent overview and introduction. Before I turn to the other 2 panelists, I'd like to just ask you a quick follow-up question, which is that you mentioned that deterrence needs to be paired with détente and confidence building measures, CBMs. I'm wondering if you could maybe speculate a little bit as to why these efforts at CBMs have failed, particularly in recent decades, why we've seen this security architecture, that was painstakingly constructed over the course of several decades, collapse gradually or erode gradually. In other words, what is the source of today's great power malaise? Is this simply because of different actions that opposing sides have been taking that one or the other side finds disagreeable? Or is there something deeper going on here? Is this about fundamentally incompatible norms and visions for European security and the European security architecture? Or is it, perhaps the fact that we're in a period of global transition and no one really wants to tie their hands in such a context?
Well, that's a quick question, not a quick answer, but a few ideas. One, I think the cooperation is not the same thing as harmony. The cooperation is usually in the context of conflict. And in the early 1990s, I think everybody presupposed that we had actually come to the end of history and that we would continue on some kind of linear trajectory where there would be no more conflict situations. And there wasn't a big investment in trying to bring Russia into a security architecture, in trying to prevent or anticipate certain problems. And therefore, we all kind of assumed that the situation would continue in a harmonious way. And therefore, I don't think enough political energy was invested in actually making the structures work themselves. The biggest problem that we have at the moment is a breakdown of trust, a trust between countries, a trust of governments in the view of institutions, that they don't think that these institutions are up to the job, and a breakdown of trust of people in their governments and those institutions. And therefore, people are looking for their own national solutions at precisely a time when countries need to be working together.
Thanks very much, Walter. And a reminder to all of our attendees that you can pose your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the chat, use the Q&A function. Over to you, Carrie, on this question of deterrence. I'm wondering, in your experience in being part of many of these deliberations and in your personal analysis, how much do you think that deterrence can be a component of stability? As how much of a necessary component is it, especially given the particularities concerning European geography and the European balance of power? Where does deterrence fit into a stable security architecture and balance of power in Europe? And at what point does deterrence sort of cross over into generating instability? So basically, how much focus on deterrence should there be? And I'll start off with a few questions in general about European security, and then we'll turn to the Canadian angle afterwards.
All right, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I will be speaking to my personal experience. I'm not with government anymore, but obviously when I was working on the immediate response to Russian attempted annexation of Crimea in the aftermath, I was representing the government at the time. So I'll be speaking to what I know, but not speaking on behalf of the government. I'm no longer with the Canadian government. Again, you've asked a short question that could have very many different long answers. I'll try and give a shortest answer. You asked whether deterrence must always be a component of stability. I think in the case of Russia and Europe now, I do think it needs to be. The fact that Russia crossed European borders using force, using military assets, was a game changer for Europe. It's kind of trite to say it, but the first, not really the first, Georgia was the first, but the international community didn't react as vociferously or as aggressively as they did with Crimea. But the fact that borders are breached in Europe, as I said, was a game changer. So it's clear that Russia, that's tripled its military spending over the last few years, that it has the capacity and at times the will to flex that military muscle. And because of that, absolutely essential that deterrence be part of the Western playbook. But deterrence is at its heart political as well. So it's not just about ensuring that there are military assets placed on the other side of borders that Russia might think about crossing, the Baltics, but it's also about ensuring that the West, whether it's NATO, EU, depending on what the response is, that there's a better understanding of what it takes to arrive at decisions, and that there is a better understanding of channels of dialogue and how you need to use them as part of deterrence. So that's my general answer. And then specifically on Russia. So if you look at, for instance, the enhanced forward presence in the Baltics, it took NATO a while after Crimea to come to that point. There was a realization inside NATO that there'd been an imbalance, that NATO had been building up in the south for a while, Naples, et cetera. And so in a way, building that forward presence in the Baltics was rewriting an imbalance. But it was also sending a political message. It's not your grandfather's deterrence with hundreds of thousands of troops standing toe to toe across a border. It's not like that. It's a political message with smaller, albeit, multinational battle groups. It sends that political message and changes the calculus of Russia, understanding that if you seek to cross a border again, you're going to bring the alliance coming down on your head. And that's meant to change the risk calculus. At the same time, inside NATO, there was a lot of work on how decisions could be made in a way where you understand that there's below conflict threshold gray zone activities, and attribution is very, very difficult. And yet deterrence relies on solidarity of messaging and response. So response isn't always going to be, or will rarely be, something military. It's more of a political response. So, but deterrence is just part of that equation. There's the political aspect of deterrence, but there's also all the other elements where you're creating an attractive model, and a model that can deliver security in a much broader way than, than your grandparents' Cold War.
I don't want to get too tied up in military strategy, but you do raise something that begs a follow-up question, which does concern NATO's enhanced forward presence. And it brings up sort of memories of tripwire during the eras of Ike Eisenhower and then massive retaliation. Basically, if Russia wanted to conquer the Baltics, they could do so in a matter of hours. And I don't think that a few thousand troops, NATO troops in Eastern Europe, would particularly change that. So what would you say to the counter argument that basically sending this enhanced forward presence into Poland and the Baltics effectively, raises the temperature a little bit on questions of European security, aggravates relations with Russia, and doesn't really achieve anything strategically?
I'm shaking my head. Again, that's why I focused on deterrence as a political fact. And the term tripwire was much debated when enhanced forward presence, we were making that decision, we collectively at NATO. And the idea isn't that, a toe gets steps across a border and NATO comes crashing down on your head. The idea is that the alliance will react in solidarity. And can it react immediately? Depends where, to be frank, but will it react? The message is it will react. And coupled with that is also a considerable amount of work to build the resilience of states that might be more vulnerable, states inside the alliance, states on the periphery of the alliance that might be more vulnerable. So to build resilience as well. So saying it's an empty construct because you don't have the same number of troops sitting across the border is, I think, fundamentally misunderstanding a modern form of deterrence. That's my personal take on it.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Doug, over to you. We conducted polling for our report on a number of questions, and clear majorities, more than 2/3 of all respondents, believe that both Russia and the United States should play an integral role in the European security system. Now, obviously, that does not square with the reality that the European security system of today, despite various appearances, is in fact quite exclusionary. On the one hand, you do have NATO, and on the other hand, you have Russia. It is not a shared collective security system for Europe, in effect, regardless of the legacy of the NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council, et cetera. So, how do you, I know you've been thinking a lot recently about Europe-Russia questions. How do you square that circle of the need to ensure that the two most powerful countries in the Euro-Atlantic region are included in European security, And how do you square that with you know with the world that we're in right now, in which there's increasing mistrust that has been building up over the past few years?
Sure, thanks. I mean, I can remember a time not too long ago during Vladimir Putin's first presidency, when it was fairly normal for Russian senior security officials to say confidently that they expect their country to be in NATO by the end of that decade. Things changed fast, and they changed dramatically, and it's useful to remember that, because it's useful to keep in mind pathways from where we are now to a possible cooperative future. And I think most of the powers are doing that, but have run into the limits of their policies. So basically, the report we're discussing carries with it an underlying question, which I don't think it's fully able to answer, probably because there aren't a lot of clear answers. And that question is, how do you create a cooperative security regime among a group of countries when one of those countries is your major security threat to the point of having invaded and seized territory and is not fully cooperative? In the case of Russia and the related case of Belarus, how do you compel cooperation around shared security issues, or incentivize cooperation around shared security issues, and get past the fundamental threat coming from that country? If you begin talking, as Walter Kemp suggested, on what basis would those talks begin? How do we get to a position where the sort of dialogue and cooperation that is being described is possible? And I'd argue that both Canada and Europe, and sometimes the United States, have continued to hold that sort of dialogue as their desired end goal, through the Georgia and Crimea crises, and the downing of the jetliner, and more recently the Navalny imprisonment. But they've sought to reach that point through different means. For the past 7 years, Canada's approach and largely the United States approach to the Russia problem has been through unilateral targeted sanctions, mainly. When I speak to European foreign and security officials, they speak of attempted engagement as still being their main baseline, although I think that's changed during the last year, with the understanding that they believe that the threat of a Russia-China alliance is a larger threat than posed directly by Russia, and that there may be possibilities for engagement, that the institutions and treaties that are still working could be built upon. I think these two approaches have both reached their limits. Targeted sanctions layered upon one another have failed. They've succeeded as punishment. They have had an impact on the Russian economy, but they've failed to cause changes, and there's not a good built-in mechanism for those changes to happen. There's not a good path out of them. Engagement has also reached its limit. And I wrote about this recently, but I think there is an answer to the question posed in this report. And I think there are mechanisms that can bring a rogue regime back to cooperative normalcy, although definitely not certainly. And we have a good example of this mechanism in front of us in the form of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And by that, I do not mean literally having a JCPOA for Russia. The issue with Russia is not the one with Iran, which was compliance with the non-proliferation treaty, but the underlying mechanism, which is to take the logic of sanctions and reverse it by, first of all, having population targeted sanctions rather than individual targeted sanctions, which can be reversed and withdrawn under the condition of a monitored compliance with something that can bring the country, despite having very different values and leadership, into a position of cooperation. Now, one of the problems with the sanctions regime has been that there's basically two things that sanctions can do with regard to the internal political situation of a target country. One of which is that it can, the population of that country can blame their own leader for the imposition of, and the hardship caused by those sanctions. The other of which, of course, is that that leader can use messaging to turn the population against the countries that have imposed the sanctions. Certainly the latter is the case in Russia. With Iran, it's interesting because the introduction of the JCPOA caused a shift in public views from one of those poles to the other, from seeing the hardship of restrictions on banking, on international travel, and so on, as being the fault of the United States and Britain and the EU, to a position where they started to see those hardships as being the fault of their own leaders for having failed to comply with the terms of the treaty. Could something like that work with Russia as a pathway to a cooperative security regime, to say, we're going to impose tougher sanctions that will affect the whole population, cut Russia out of SWIFT and other banking networks, put harder restrictions on travel, in exchange for a negotiated treaty. And Russia would know this well. It was party to the JCPOA. It's part of monitored compliance agreements such as the OSCE's Vienna document, and of course the arms control agreements, which are based on monitored compliance, and have a agreed upon monitored compliance regime for the return of Crimea, some guarantees of the lives and livelihoods of political opposition figures. You could name the regime. It sounds very far-fetched at the moment. It's very hard to imagine the Putin regime giving into this. On the other hand, there are some factors that could make it work. Russia is extremely dependent on external economies. It is not a country that can economically manage on its own. If economic isolation was agreed upon, it would have that effect on the population. Its leadership is highly dependent for its legitimacy on its population's economic stability and well-being, and including things like ability to keep most of their middle-class bank accounts in Europe and things like that. So it could be done. There's a lot of barriers to get past among still very large divergences between the views of European leaders and North American leaders as to the long-term path of approaching Russia. And the election in Germany in September could change that dramatically, although we don't really know how. We don't really know whether European leaders are willing to trust the United States, another theme of this report, as a long-term partner in any form of engagement with Russia. Certainly you hear a lot from foreign policy circles in Germany and France now about a desire to wait another 8 years to see if the United States is going to return to some sort of stability as a partner. And the crisis of the Trump period has amplified an existing wariness of cooperation with the United States and desire to create European-focused circles. Where does Canada fall into that? It's a difficult position. Canada is unique in that it does have stable and continuous views on Europe. It has a cross-party consensus among the two major parties likely to govern Canada throughout the next 50 years. Around how to approach Russia, which is confrontation-based. Canada has fairly low stakes in Russia economically, so it can afford an isolating position. So the question is, do we continue with this as Canada, or do we start talking about, with our European partners and the United States, around trying to come up with a mechanism that will move from confrontation and sanctions to some form of change within Russia and with Russia's stance that would allow a cooperative security regime to be possible. It's a long-term goal, but I think we do need to start talking about mechanisms based on pathways to the end of sanctions rather than simply layering on of additional sanctions.
Okay, thank you very much, Doug, and thank you for raising that interesting idea. I'll leave the Canadian angle just for a little bit later, and I suppose it's worth emphasizing, of course, that the multiple rounds of sanctions leading up to the JCPOA on Iran were adopted in the context of the UN Security Council. It was an example of multilateralism clearly at work. Whereas Russia, being a P5 member, would obviously not agree to sanctions against itself. So this could, perhaps further entrench the notion or the idea that, the West is acting sort of alone unilaterally and not to uphold the sort of the global rules-based system, if you will. So, it's an interesting idea, although I'm not sure how much Russians would take kindly to being compared to rogue countries like Iran and North Korea, seeing as they're, a great, see themselves as a prestigious great power in their own right, I assume. But we have a question from the audience, actually, concerning the United States and Russia, and the fact that they actually, perhaps neither of them is interested in the status quo. And that might be some of the source of today's malaise. We tend to view in the West this notion that, we in the West are defenders of the status quo, of the rules-based order, of the liberal international order, and that Russia is a revanchist or revisionist or dissatisfied power. Russia would, of course, say the opposite, that Russia is defending the, existing system, that includes, for example, the Yalta Order going back to World War II, and that it's the West, that took advantage of Russia's weakness in the 1990s to revise Europe's security order against Russia's interests. But it could be that this third idea that was proposed by one of our audience members could be the case, that both the United States and Russia are revisionist powers to a certain extent, that Russia wants to reestablish itself as a great power, that the United States is less and less interested in questions of European security, and therefore in holding up the existing order. Doug, what do you make of that to a certain extent? Is it possible to see these two countries both as revisionists at the same time?
I guess the underlying question there is there an irreconcilable epistemological chasm between Russian and Western polities? Certainly the leadership and elite circles of Russia currently would like people to believe that, and a Eurasianist ideology has become popular. But I think you need to create a divide between to what extent the Russian population goes along with that form of logic instrumentally, and because echoing it provides some security, and to what extent that's actually a core belief. And I mean, as I said in my initial remark, this is something that's changeable. I think to the extent that chasm exists, I think it's worth our efforts to change it. And yes, in response to what you said, of course, it cannot be something that's structured as a Western powers versus Russia thing. In order for any mechanism of change to work, the mechanism of change that compels the population, it needs to have buy-in from some non-Western powers, and that will take some effort. It cannot come from the UN Security Council because of the structure of the UN Security Council. We're running out of avenues to change that outlook in Russian populations, although there's a lot of indication on the streets that there's a big appetite for a change in that perspective. The notion of a post-1990s security guaranteed by Putin with a Eurasian circle is growing tired to the Russian population. It's quite evident that it's not working, and there's an appetite for something else. Certainly the banning of NGOs and civil society organizations within Russia was part of an understanding that the population is quite vulnerable to change. So we do need to come up with multilateral approaches to causing attitude change within populations and electorates, including supporting opposition, including dialogues that work past government toward people, but also including mechanisms, as I said, that can point to an end of the confrontation, that can make clear to populations what would be required of their leaders in order to end the hardship of sanctions.
Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought there. Walter, Minsk has attempted in recent years to position itself as sort of a bridge between East and West, both at the governmental level, but also at the Track 2 level. I've been involved with the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. But since the beginning of the protests last year, obviously Alexander Lukashenko has depended increasingly on Vladimir Putin to stay in power. And that has sort of removed a possible site for East-West dialogue from the equation. And this has really helped to calcify the lines between East and West. So I'm wondering at this point whether you think that everything basically rides on US-Russia relations at this point, or whether there's still room for middle powers to propose some sort of initiatives that could de-escalate tension.
As Doug said, things are changing very quickly and quite dramatically. I can remember less than 2 years ago, there was talk of a kind of Helsinki 2.0, which was being pushed by Belarus. Belarus's Minsk is some kind of hub for cooperative dialogue. That's completely gone out the window. And you have to ask yourself, the reason why people were latching onto that is that Belarus looked like it was trying to be a bridge builder, which then made Moscow a little bit nervous. But who are the bridge builders today? When you go back to the late 1960s, early 1970s, you had the neutral and non-aligned movement. You had Switzerland, Finland, which kind of started the whole Helsinki process. Where would that start today? And I'm thinking it doesn't necessarily have to start among countries. And that was part of the logic of the Cooperative Security Initiative. And there's a question in the chat, actually more of a comment, about how there was a lack of cooperation with COVID, and shouldn't that make us kind of pessimistic about the possibility of countries cooperating? I disagree. I think there was actually quite a bit of cooperation among scientists dealing with COVID, and that in order to deal with many of these problems without passports, we're going to need a much broader set of people involved. That most of these issues are more complicated and frankly important to be left only to diplomats and politicians, that we're going to need civil society, private sector, scientists. We saw this with the Paris agreements. You see it now with the youth and the Fridays for the Future, that there can be cooperation, but maybe starting from places besides or in addition to possible cooperation between governments. So confidence building measures related to culture, to technology, perhaps, to sports, but not necessarily only through interstate relations. But one other point that I want to pick up from Doug, which relates to your question about Belarus, was how do you deal with a situation with 57 non-like-minded countries where decisions are taken on the basis of consensus, and at least one or two of them are major spoilers? What do? We had this problem with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Doug made the point about Russia and Belarus. But let's scale that up. Look at the same problem at an international level. One of Biden's proposals was to have a summit of democracies. Great idea, but then you couldn't invite half of the countries of the world. So what do? Do you wait until China and Russia become more like us? You talk about waiting 4 years or 8 years to see who the future president of the United States will be. Are these countries really going to change so much that they would become liberal democracies? So I don't see that necessarily as working. We have to find ways to engage with countries that don't necessarily share the same values. And I'm not, though, talking about appeasement. That cooperation is only going to be credible if you actually have the deterrence at the same side. Otherwise, you're going to be walked all over by the other side. So this is a very careful calibration of national interests, alliances, but also opening ways for dialogue. I think it's extremely difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. And if we're not all revisionists in a rapidly changing world, then I think we have a problem. Because what is the status quo now? We're going to need more imagination, more entry points for dialogue, and be a bit more agile.
I'd like to pivot towards Canada in the final 25 minutes that we've got here. And my next question is for Kerry. Canada has made a significant point, very vocal point of standing with Ukraine, both tangibly and in terms of sort of a vocal stance. I'm wondering, based on the discussion we've had so far, how can Canada square its commitments to Ukraine on the one hand with the need for a more stable and cooperative security architecture in Europe, which may require, deeper and more sustained dialogue with Russia than we have right now.
Thanks, Zach. Well, first part of your question, yes, Canada's been vocal, but the point really isn't mostly about Canada standing up and being quite clear about not just Crimea, but the Donbass and Russians' illegitimate, unacceptable moves in Crimea and the Donbass. There's actually been a whole layer of layers of tools that Canada's deployed, multilateral, plurilateral, bilateral, to bring about stabilization in Ukraine and increased resilience. So it goes back to Walter's question a minute ago. What do you do when you need consensus in OSCE with 57 states? What do you do when you need consensus in NATO? Are you rendered immobile? Not at all. So if I think through Canada's engagement in Ukraine as an example, so working through the OSCE SMM, Russia's on the SMM, but the SMM has been undeniably something quite useful. Working bilaterally, but in really close coordination with a few like-minded US, UK, and others on training of military, training of police. Working closely with the EU and others to bolster media capacity, independent journalism, credible journalism, independent judiciary, bolster government, bolster trade. So layers and layers that aren't just about diplomats, they're about using expertise of the state and capacity building that way, but well beyond the state, people to people ties, blah, blah, blah. So the point is that if you're just focusing at multilateral, what looks like paralysis is not paralysis at all. You use those multilateral fora where you can't necessarily make decisions. Like OSCE makes decisions at ministerial level, and it makes very, very few of them. I remember a few years walking into one of the ministerial meetings, and Minister Lavrov was there, and he said with a huge grin on his face, well, we've managed to come up with 2 decisions. So, but decisions are made there, but discussion happens below, and cooperation happens below that in many, many ways. So the point is that it's not just about standing up and waving a flag and condemning, it's actually building something. And it's more about building an attractive model. I mean, everyone's hope at the beginning, or maybe Russia's fear, was that Ukraine would follow the same economic growth as Poland, right? So that's not necessarily not going to happen, but it's been stalled a bit. So how do you square that with the need to talk to Russia? I also think it's a bit of a straw man in a way to say that there is no dialogue with Russia. There is no cooperation with Russia. There is. You find those areas where you can. So even throughout this, prior to Crimea, after Crimea, there was still continuing cooperation with Russia, even at the point where Russian planes were coming very close to North American airspace. There was still cooperation in the Arctic with Russia. And Minister Garneau met fairly recently with Lavrov. So those discussions happen. You use them to send hard political messages, but you also use them to continue cooperation on areas where you can cooperate. Granted, that funnel of issues on which cooperation can happen is much, much narrower, but it doesn't mean it can't, and it doesn't mean that it's stopped, and it doesn't mean that it won't in the future. I guess my last point is about Doug's idea that you use a reverse sanction approach under JCPOA and apply it to Russia. Maybe. It's an interesting idea, but the problem is you have to begin with Crimea. And I don't know how far you could get with Crimea. And the message, not just from Ukraine, but from the Baltics as well, was you need to stay the course. It was so important that Canada, other allies, stayed the course in the Baltics and saying we will not recognize Soviet Union presence in the Baltics. That was really, really helpful. So what do you do with Crimea? If the only way for that mechanism to work is to have Russia agree to move out of Crimea, gosh, I'd really be happy if that were within the realm of possibility. And I don't see being able to start on something else, because that message about not crossing borders, that's one of those principles you talked about that you need to cleave to. It's at the core of the European security architecture. And as I'm saying that, I'm thinking also back to some law class lectures that I've heard Minister Lavrov give about Kosovo and borders, etc. But international law doesn't work that way. International law is built through state practice, and the fact that it's not always met with the same understanding of what international law requires doesn't mean that international law is broken. It just means that those norms are continuously remaking themselves. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Carrie. And let's not forget as well that Turkey altered the borders of Cyprus in 1975 and remains a valued Western ally within NATO, despite certain irritants, obviously, in that relationship. And I'm glad you raised the Poland and Ukraine comparison, because those are two countries with very similar sized populations who had roughly the same size economy in the late 1980s. And today, 3 decades later, Poland has an economy that is 3 times the size of Ukraine's. So it just goes to show that these security issues really do come with direct impacts for people's lives, and really highlights the importance of the conversation we're having today. We have a question from the audience from Robert Sinclair, who's at the Canadian mission to the European Union in Brussels. And he asks what lessons we can apply from Canada's experience in Europe to our posture in the Arctic, where Russia, of course, is also a very important actor, if not the most powerful actor. And I'll expand the scope of the question, if you don't mind, and I'll pose it to you again, Carrie, which is, where does Europe actually now lie in the list of Canadian priorities this century? Because obviously continental defense for a country that's isolated geographically from the rest of the world is going to be the most important thing. So North America and the Arctic, is always going to be, a high-ranking priority. The global balance of power is shifting towards Asia, and there's a growing recognition that Canada needs to make up for lost time and really engage more deeply in Asia, not just in the economic sphere, but you're seeing Canada even in the security sphere start to deepen relations with Japan and others. So does that leave Europe dead last right now in Canada's priorities, despite the central role that it played in Canadian foreign policy from 1949, if not from before 1949 onwards?
Those are two separate questions. Rob's is hard, yours is harder. Lessons from Europe that we can apply to the Arctic. It's a hard one because we've been, for a number of years, the focus, and I think it's still true, that the focus is on the full range of Arctic issues. So it's not focused around security sovereignty, nor is our relationship with Europe. So, and Canada had taken care to not paint the Arctic as an area where there are security risks. But my personal perspective is that that is changing. It's changing with Russia's equipping itself with more capable subs and using those subs in areas that start to head toward, not necessarily towards the Arctic, but certainly with the capability to head closer to the Arctic. So I think it would be unwise to continue to downplay the security aspect of the Arctic. But I think eyes wide open is the lesson that we learn from Europe that we can apply to the security questions around our Arctic. But other lessons from Europe, that you need to use layers of cooperation across a whole panoply of economic, trade and economic, building capacity, etc. So Arctic Council actually works pretty well. On your bigger question about where Europe lies, is it dead last? I mean, except for the immediate post-war period, I don't think it's fair to say that Europe ever occupied kind of the sole focus of Canadian foreign policy. What is true is that we play between looking to the US as our kind of main protector, and then working with closer allies, UK, etc., in Europe. And that's been a constant. But so I guess I'll break down your question or my answer into two parts. How much do we need to worry about European security? And then how much do we work with Europe? And those are two different questions. If you're asking how much Canada needs to worry about European security, more than it did in the 90s and much more than it did in 2014 before Crimea. But I think the bigger question is, so the major security risks facing Canada don't come from Europe, but I do think a lot of the partnership to counter and mitigate security risks comes from Europe. They're natural partners. Are they our only partners? Never have been. I mean, just look at the Canada-South Korea relationship, which has spanned decades. They never have been, and nor would they be. So if you look at the major trends in megatrends in foreign policy of for instance, US continuing to turn inward, is this just a remnant of Trump or is this a trend? We don't know yet. So we need our friends in Europe. Other friends too, we need our friends in Europe. Is it about great power competition? Doug said earlier that you can't really just look at how you deal with Russia without also thinking about China. Okay, on China, Europe is a force multiplier for us. If we stand up and shake our fist at China alone, we're much more vulnerable. So if you look at the recent initiative to have like a statement on hostage diplomacy, the fact that European states were aligning and states from around the world were aligning with Canada, it's an important signal, right? So natural partner. If the other mega trend is increasing authoritarianism, then to counter that, you need to attack all of those elements of the playbook of authoritarianism. So help build democracy, help build resilient democratic institutions, freedom of the media, protecting civil space for people to express themselves politically. Who do we work well with? Sometimes Japan, sometimes South Korea, but always, always our European partners. And then on those other broad changes, climate change, pandemics, natural disasters, mass migration. So Europe will always be embedded in our foreign policy. So I think it's a misnomer to say it was always front and center. It has been periodically, but it will always be there. And certainly not dead last, not at all.
That's a very thoughtful and nuanced answer. Thank you very much, Carrie. Doug, my next question is for you, which is, going back to 1867, Canada decided not to, build up its military capacities too much for fear of aggravating the United States. This was basically a tacit recognition from Canada's birth that, there was going to be American preeminence, at least on the North American continent. But today, since 1991, the United States has a global empire. So deferring to American preeminence to a certain extent means that Canada doesn't have an independent foreign policy anymore at all. And I say this sort of thinking a little bit about what Emmanuel Macron has done over the past couple of years in proposing, a new, initiative of dialogue with Russia, which is of course not, borne a lot of results, but nonetheless, evidences France's capability and desire to remain an independent thinker that can propose its own initiatives. So I'm wondering, what that says about Canada right now. Is Canada no longer an independent thinker on the world stage at this point with its own independent foreign policy?
I think Canada had a real slap in the face after January 21st, 2017, when it was forced to confront the fact that a lot of what it saw as unilateral foreign policy goals vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis lots of other places, were contingent on having a reasonably stable United States partner in those things to a degree that probably wasn't visible in 2015. The idea that Canada would diverge from the United States was always present in foreign policy calculations, but the idea that the United States would completely go off the map on some of these things and work contrary to Canada's interests on a number of files was a shock. And it did make it apparent how difficult it is to achieve a path to an autonomous foreign policy without the United States being on board. And I think it's a warning for the rest of the next century, even if we're fairly safe in thinking the United States will have sensible government after the next several elections, there's always the possibility that we will enter a period like this. So it was, as I've said, it was like a stress test for Canada, and we did not fare that well. So what we've been left to realize is that Canada's foreign policy is based on cooperative approaches through institutions. Those include NATO. Importantly, they include the European Union, with which we have a free trade agreement, but also is the important tool for European stability. And we can't stress this enough. I mean, why does Canada support Ukraine so much? Well, partly because we have a huge Ukrainian diaspora numbering in the millions, but also you have to ask the question, why did Ukraine go the direction it did and not the direction that Belarus and Russia did? And that was largely because it had an on-ramp into European institutions, especially the European Union. A faint hope, you could say, given its distance from meeting the political and economic qualifications to get in. And Canada was able to give that a little bit of a shove, including through some important things that are worth considering. Canada made the decision in the 2000s to use its diplomatic resources to support opposition movements that opposed the government of Ukraine. And it was an important example that smaller countries can use their diplomatic resources in unorthodox ways to support changes within countries. It's a very risky strategy. It was attempted with Venezuela as well, but it can be done. And I would point to Ukraine, I would point to Serbia as another example of a country where having a chance in the medium term of becoming part of European institutions that are desired by the population has maintained stability. We've had regimes and leaderships in Serbia that are very illiberal, very opposed to a lot of European and Western values, but nevertheless have not touched the tripwires of Kosovo and of other forms of regional instability because they know their populations desire that pathway. So Canada needs to act through institutions that are acting on countries through their population's interest in those institutions and their values. And we could have a whole other conversation about Canada's approach to China and how that's changed and what institutional mechanisms can work on China. And that's a much more difficult thing. It requires a degree of multilateralism that has not yet solidified. But in terms of European security, I think we've now realized that the institutions within Europe matter, and Canada's role in connecting with them in NATO and the EU and the other OSCE, the other institutions, as Carrie Buck said, circumpolar relations have generally remained fairly stable and well managed despite the turn to authoritarianism in Russia, because the institutions that uphold them have generally held up. So we could use this. We could use the Arctic example as a model, a recognition that Canada can use Europe, as someone said, as a force multiplier. Because it's never going to be a military superpower. There's no point in it. It's never going to be able to completely act unilaterally, and we now know that much more strongly. But European institutions are our pathway.
Thanks very much, Doug. The questions are, of course, pouring in right now, just as we only have 5 minutes left in our panel. So unfortunately, we won't get to all of them. But for those of them we don't get to, please feel free to email them to info@peacediplomacy.org. That's info@peacediplomacy.org, and we'd be happy to forward them along to the panelists. In the 5 minutes that we have left, I'd just like to ask each of you one last question, and please provide as succinct a response as possible. First question to Walter, and this is from Angela Vastis, who's a research analyst at the NATO Research Group. And I'm posing it to you because of your experience at the OSCE, and in particular with a focus on the third basket there, because she asks, what role does media play in affecting attempts to achieve reasonable and sustainable diplomacy between nations, including social media, for example, Azerbaijan and Armenia. She says, for example, the pressure brought about by certain echo chambers online now polarizes the desired outcome of opposing sides and can make finding a middle ground increasingly difficult in today's world. What do you think?
Thanks. I realize time is very limited. I wanted to take the question on the Arctic, for example, or John Packer's comment, which I full-heartedly agree with. But on this one issue, I think it's bigger than the media. I think it's more to do with public policy. And in a case like between Armenia and Azerbaijan, governments or leaders that may have the courage to move towards peace also then need to prepare their constituencies for peace, especially when there's been a very toxic narrative for a whole generation. So yes, social media, the media more generally, can poison a relationship, but then the challenge is, if leaders are ready to take that step and improve relations, how do they bring their populations along with them? And I think that gets back to Doug's point about engaging with populations and not only with governments, and making sure that the steps are in place, that there's some kind of narrative that people understand the self-interest, the kind of peace dividend potentially in these kind of situations. Zach, for 10 seconds, briefly on Rob Sinclair's question about the Arctic, can I just say one lesson learned is, why not reverse engineer for the Arctic the approach that Canada takes in Europe? What is Canada's deterrent in the Arctic? Yes, the Arctic Council is useful in terms of cooperation, but I realize I'm now arguing the other side of the argument. How credible is Canada's deterrent in the Arctic? If we're going to be the true North, strong and free, then at some point we have to show the flag.
Thanks very much, Walter. Question for Doug. In our report, 64% of respondents to our polling said that new rules and agreements are going to be needed to deal with contemporary security challenges in Europe, which basically evidences the fact that we are in a period of transition. Yet in Canada, particularly, we saw this under the tenure of Chrystia Freeland as foreign minister. We really emphasized over and over again our desire to defend the existing rules-based international order. That was an often repeated theme. So I'm wondering, if we constantly reiterate our desire to defend the existing order, what does that say about Canada's ability to play its traditional role of being a helpful and pragmatic fixer in Europe, but also on a global stage going forward?
Well, rules-based international order was always a bit of a vague catchphrase. However, I think it has some important substance to it in that there are existing rules and institutions that work, and that it's worth a smaller country's, a medium-sized country's efforts to try to enforce adherence to those, either through acting on regimes or acting on populations to do that. To talk about a new paradigm in institutional structures of international relations might be useful, certainly, but that's actually part of the existing international order. It's not like we're going to bomb everything and have some big war and tear it up and create some new form of institution. This isn't like the shift from the League of Nations to the United Nations. Any talk of a future structure that will allow us to engage in a more constructive way with countries that have become damaging to their own populations in a severe way is going to require building on the existing institutional structures rather than tearing them up. So if we want to talk about having a cooperative security regime or something like that, it's not going to appear out of the blue. It's not going to appear by simply sitting down and talking. It's going to appear by looking at what structures exist for having a security regime in the world that actually exists, and asking what it would take to cause the countries that are outside of it to be brought into the fold, either through their leaders or through their populations.
Thanks so much, Doug. And final question to Carrie, just to leave our audience with some food for thought, which is, what can Canada contribute to European security that other countries cannot necessarily contribute? What's our unique contribution going forward?
I think, okay, I'm going to say something that will get me in trouble at work for my former job, but in my family too. I think we suffer from Lester Pearson, in that we keep asking ourselves, where can Canada lead? Well, that's great. That's a great question. But my personal view is to lead, you have to invest. You have to invest in professionalized diplomacy. And I don't mean just a narrow range. You have to invest in a way where the whole of government understands that there's a world out there and that international matters. And I don't see it as much in the public debate. So if you look at the vaccine debate that's going on now, this is a virus that's come across borders. And I understand the politics of it, focusing very, very much on vaccinating our own population. We're not talking as much about sharing. We're not talking as much about what we do internationally to prevent the next pandemic. So Canada needs to turn a little more outward. I think we're sleepwalking into an era where we risk not mattering very much. So we need to invest. But we keep asking, where can we lead, instead of saying, do we have the tools to lead? And I don't think we're building those tools. And I think that's an underinvestment over a long period. But to not be negative, so the positive answer is we do diplomacy differently through a very wide range of pragmatic tools. We have a convening power. We have a history of coming up with ideas that draw people to tables. So sometimes the ideas are human security, right? Very practical sense. How do you build human security? How do you do it? You bolster democratic institutions. You bolster the media. You bolster civil space for opposition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're really good at that. And we've let it, we haven't let it fall fallow. That's the wrong expression. But I think we have been underinvesting. And underinvesting also in the public and political debate, about how much the world matters to Canada. We keep saying the world needs more Canada. Well, I think Canada needs more of the world.
Very well said, and I think that's a great place on which to leave it. Doug Saunders, Carrie Buck, Walter Kemp, thank you so much for a tremendously thought-provoking event. I hope we can do it again sometime. And thank you to all of our audience for joining us today for this collaborative event, this cooperative event, if you will, between the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir. Goodbye. Auf Wiedersehen.